Hi guys, a couple of friends of mine had a debate question, and it's a question I get pretty often. So I thought rather than just respond to them specifically, I'd make a little bit of video and we can share and hopefully all benefit from it. So this was the question. This house would allow the creation of designer babies. That's the question that they posed. And before that, yes, Australia is going well. Hope you guys are doing well too. And this is how they planned to approach the debate, right? So they said they see it as a reverse ban debate, meaning assuming there's a ban and then just undo that ban. On government, we would restrict so that we would allow designer babies only for the health of the baby. Basically, only want to enhance it is for the purpose of making the baby healthier so that you get them to the right strength or weight. Essentially, we just want to use government to regulate the super babies and avoid all the slippery slope wealth gap arguments. So they're asking whether you can do this or not. And my simple answer to that is yes, you can do it, but no, you should not do it. And so I'll do that in parts. I'll say why I say you can do it, and then I'll tell you why I think you shouldn't do it, and instead tell you what I think you should be doing. And I'll also give you a few exercises that you can do to, kind of test this out and decide where the right line is. And this is a very tricky issue. It's not just about what's legal or not legal, but where you get the right balance and how much of a burden that you want to take in a debate. Okay, so let's do it in parts. Let's do whether you can do it or not. Okay, and I think actually that you can. Because when is it that you can't do something? When that motion or definition is illegal, is if that motion or that definition is time or place set, right? That means restricting it to a specific time or place. And that's not the issue here. That's not an issue in the way they've defined it. Secondly is if that's a squirrel. And a squirrel means taking it out of context of the debate, right? So if you defined baby as, say, industries or companies, and designer as in like new or fashion industry, and this is a debate about the fashion industry, then that would be a squirrel. This isn't really a squirrel. I think this is maybe a little bit soft or narrow, so burden issues, but still within the general spirit of the motion, right? A debate about babies, a debate about healthcare, a debate about what parents can do. The third thing you consider when evaluating whether a motion is legal or illegal is whether that is a truism or a tautology. And that means that this is a self-proving debate or definition. And even if a debate, you think that this is mostly could be status quo, parents doing things to avoid diseases, maybe it's not self-proving. It's not something that happens everywhere. It could still be controversial, right? So self-proving means that it's not contestable at all, right? Let me try to give you an example. So let's say we defined designer as, people designing it, meaning designer means that designed by two people, by their DNA, right? So that's what we mean by designed. And baby is a child born, from a woman, created by two people. Therefore, what we want to do is we want to allow people to put their DNA together and create a baby. Now, that would be tautological because the definition of a baby is something that was created by two people based on the merging of their DNA. If you define the designer in this context as people putting together their DNA to create a baby, then it's self-proving. Okay, so the definition is neither of these things, therefore the definition is not illegal. So if the question is, can we do this? Then yes, you can do this. But if the question is, as I think it should be in all things debating, whether you should do it, then I think you shouldn't do it. And this is why I think you shouldn't do it. So I put a little slope here, and this is the slope or scale of contention, right? As we move to the right, things become more contentious, more controversial. On the left, things become less contentious, less controversial. Now, debate thrives in a space of contention, where things are contentious. If things aren't contentious, and I'm saying contention quite a bit now, so I'm going to trip up on it, but if things aren't contentious, then they're not really debatable or worth debate, or people aren't really debating them, and because there's not a lot of things around them to debate. We debated those things before, perhaps. We all agree it's wonderful, so we don't really debate those things anymore. They're not really that contentious, right? So those are the things over here on this side of the spectrum. Things like babies are cute, mostly, or that parents should be allowed to have babies if they can, or that diseases are bad and we shouldn't have diseases, or states should try to do things to prevent diseases. The scale of what you allow to do to prevent those diseases can be controversial, right? So they are allowing cloning to prevent a disease can be controversial, even if it's about preventing diseases. Having a child so that you can use some elements of that child's bone marrow perhaps to solve, or not to solve, to treat an existing child's disease is controversial, because you're using one child to help another child, and the purpose of that child created was to solve another child. There's controversy there. But just saying we want to address diseases may not necessarily be very contentious, right? So in terms of this scale of contention, I'd say if that you are looking at designing as in we want to prevent diseases of babies, that's probably somewhere around here, right? Not super contentious, because you're not really designing completely, you are preventing diseases. The scope of the debate is very, very narrow. There are also debates on the far side that are incredibly contentious. You want to design to do anything and everything, designed to create a race of soldiers. The state that is designing is not really parents, it's the state, and they're building soldiers, because soldiers are dying in wars and we need to prevent wars, so we want to create a clone army. Now that may be a bit super extreme and a little bit outside of the debate, actually, but you're taking on way too much burden, right? So you want the debate to be within this kind of middle space that's contentious enough that it is pushing, the boundaries, but still relevant, that many people, that it could be something that would be important to many people, and within the sphere of what society is very, very interested in. But this isn't really a rule. This is strategic, right? I think you should do this because that's where people expect debates to happen. And if you don't do this in this area, people will think you are avoiding the debate. But more than that, you also limit the scope of what you can debate. And let me explain that a little bit more, right? So if I do put the debate here, I say you have lots of really interesting things to talk about and can have a big, lively debate. A debate about babies is a debate about children, right? A debate about parents, a debate about science, a debate about healthcare, a debate about, what else? A debate about many different issues. But if you make the debate very, 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 very narrow, the level at which you can talk about these things is thin, right? If all you're defending is that parents should, in very extreme situations, be allowed to make very minor modifications to prevent some extremely debilitating diseases, I struggle to see how you will have more than one speaker's speech. Because after a while, you're going to be arguing that this is good and we should do good things because it's good, right? So you don't really have a lot of space to debate. But if you argue that we should allow parents choice to shape their children, the way that an extension of what we allow parents to do nowadays in the status quo. We allow parents to, perform circumcision on boys. We allow parents to pierce ears, give names. We allow parents to dictate religion, shape their childhood in many different circumstances and ways where they have long lasting impacts. And if we can extend this right at a genetic level, so that parents will be able to design character traits or design physical traits that would better reflect what the parents want in the future for their child, we think that that's an extension of parents' rights. Now, that's controversial, but it's something that moves on from the status quo of what we already allow, and isn't, in my mind at least, so far apart that people would automatically recoil in horror and say that's definitely going to be a horrible, horrible thing, right? And if you look at the debate from that level, there are many different things that you can argue, and you can make some actually reasonable and powerful arguments. And that's what I think this debate is trying to get to. And that's an interesting, that's a part of the test of what you should ask, what that debate is trying to get to. And there's a reason why the phrase or the term designer babies was used instead of just healthy babies or preventing terrible illnesses and so on and so forth, right? And that's a good test. If you're not sure where the middle line is, think about the person who created that topic and ask yourself why they use those specific words and phrases. And if you feel that what you want could be better reflected in a different way, or you're not really getting the whole gamut of what that phrase represents, then you're probably only looking at a very small part of the debate, and you're going to end up missing a larger part of the debate, and you're going to have a very small, narrow debate. Okay? So, that said, we'll go back then to what some of my friends were really worried about, which is the slippery slope wealth gap arguments and how to regulate the super babies. In response to that, and I think that's a fair concern, but respond to that with some limitations around the parameters of the model, and not in terms of the definition, and argue against it. Okay? And I'll say you can do it this way. You can limit some extreme harm. You can say parents can't do anything that would be harmful or damaging to the child, right? Like physically harmful or damaging. So I can't clone horns. I can't do experiments in the child. It has to be something that's an extension of my personality trait or something like that, right? But you don't want to say what they can do. Just pick out a few really extreme things and say these really extreme things that cause damage to the child. We're going to say parents shouldn't be allowed to do that, right? Like you're allowed to have circumcision, but you're not allowed to have genital mutilation. I think that could be a parallel that you run. And you can set these criteria, and it's very unlikely that the opposition team is going to say we want parents to be able to do that, or the debate should be about that. That sounds pretty reasonable, right? And you remove that part of the debate. You're not really removing the super babies, though. People who are very rich will be allowed to access this technology, but other people will not. And that's kind of like this point, that there's always power to those who can. People who are really rich can send their kids to special schools, to better universities, give them nicer food, give them healthcare, go to a hospital where they can give birth to this child, sometimes access IVF or things that medical treatment that we have in the status quo. So the fact that some people can is not a reason to not allow people to do it. The question is whether this will create a far more imbalanced situation in the world. And it's unlikely that just doing this will do that. In fact, if what you're arguing is we're going to use this to allow parents to prevent diseases, that also has a slippery slope wealth gap argument, right? Because if if you have to argue that we really need this to prevent some really crucial diseases, and many people are suffering from these diseases, so we really need this to address this issue, then you're saying still that this very expensive thing is going to be only available to the rich people, and rich people will be prevented from these diseases. And so you're still going to create some kind of wealth gap, right? So the wealth gap isn't removed by limiting this to chronic illnesses or serious diseases. Okay, so that's still going to end up being a serious factor in the debate. The super babies point, to some extent, the two overly crazy ones can be removed by talking about limiting extreme harm. And you can address this by talking about parents' rights, or things that parents have access to in the status quo, or how governments can step in and regulate, or you can have some kind of oversight where the same things that we do in, like, for example, euthanasia debates, where doctors will look at this and doctors will think about whether this is reasonable or unreasonable, or whether it'll be harmful. Right? Reasonable is very broad. Use a more narrow measure, like one of harm. Okay. The other thing I put in here was economies of scale. I think I addressed a little bit, and that's one way which you can use to respond to or prepare for accusations that only very few people will have access to this. And that applies to everything, right? It applies to televisions, it applies to airlines, it applies to everything. And giving government allowing this will help this technology grow and mean that more people will have access to it, rather than banning it, and that doesn't really help anybody. And you can try to flip the argument and show how many people will be left out, and they may have a real reason to access this, maybe. Although I don't think this is a debate about reducing harm. It's really a debate about extending choice and the rights that parents have, and a debate about technology and medical ethics and the boundaries of those things. A debate that leads to some really interesting comparisons of other things that people can do, and pushing the boundaries of science. And while the benefits of some of those things may not seem really obvious in the beginning, later on people do see some serious benefits, right? And even if that benefit is just making people feel really, really healthy, not healthy, happy, and healthy and happy. Because if you think about a lot of things that science allows us to do, like cosmetic surgery, for example, not a lot of that is about having a very specific medical reason to do it, but it has a more complicated reasoning behind your identity and behind your happiness and so on and so forth. Even just the science that allows parents to have children, even though some parents are genetically not able to have children, we create science around, or science helps supports them to do that. And there is a debate around whether that science has a role or should have a role in extending this right? Like it's not a right for everybody to have kids, but we do that because we want them to be happy, or we recognize that people should be allowed to pursue happiness, and it's if that happiness means an extension of their progeny, an extension of who they are through their children, then states should allow people to do that while trying to prevent too much harm or happening, or in an ideal world, prevent any harm happening to that child, right? And that's what this debate is about. It's about that kind of balance. That brings me to the end of this. I don't want to go into an extensive review of that debate, but this is more about how to set the right burden and the right scope. So I've come up with a couple of practice topics here, and your goal is to try to set the debate right in this sweet spot, right? The spot with the sweets. And if it's over here, it's soft. If it's over here, it's too hard. And what I think you should do is have a little bit of an exercise, maybe with a bunch of friends, and try to define the debate in 3 different ways. So this house will legalize drugs soft, this house will legalize drugs in this middle, and this house will legalize drugs hard, right? And try to get to that just in the middle Baby locks approach. And sometimes it's hard to know where that is, and often there's a very broad scale of what fits in here, but it's easier to detect when something is too hard or when something is too soft. So I think a good way to practice this is go through different topics and think about the extreme definitions of them, right? And if you know where you think the boundaries are, then your goal is just to try to avoid those boundaries and try to be more or less in the middle. Okay, so thank you very much, my friends, for that question. I hope this was helpful in answering your question specifically, but also anyone else who has a similar question. And if anybody else does have a question, you can email that question to me, or better yet, post it on our Facebook page, and we will do our best to answer that question. Cheers. Good night.